Alright, boyos, finally back with another video. So today I wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while, and we'll be talking about Oofy Doofy and boomer parents and how they harm society and how they fail their sub-5 male children. And both have a lot of similarities, although the difference between Oofy Doofy and boomer parents is not every boomer parent is going to be reckless or terrible, but a lot are, especially if they had kids late, like Gen Z or younger millennial children. And with both, a common thing that they'll do is they'll be overly protective. I brought this up in my family pill video I did about 8 months ago. Uh, and I talked about how they're usually overly protective in bad ways and they don't allow their kids to develop in a good way. I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, you need to be really reckless with your kid. You just gotta allow them to eat Captain Crunch every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But with Oofy Doofies, they're either going to be super overly protective. They aren't going to teach their children how to manage their lives, and they don't really have a good grasp on how to raise their children. And with boomer parents, particularly, you have a lot of them, and also with Oofy Doofies, they are very out of touch with how the world works. Again, with boomers, they lived in the most economically prosperous time in recent history, could buy a house for like $10,000 and could retire on 150K or 200K or 500K or a million. And they aren't really, besides the economy, they don't really understand the current affairs of what their children will go through and how their children will manage and just simply the trends that people follow. And some people might go, oh, but trends are kind of cringy and stuff. Not in this sense, because if you have a child that's out of touch, like being a sub 5 male is already bad, but a sub 5 child who isn't able to uh, function with broader society, at least in their formative years. I'm not going to get into the if you should be against or for certain trends when you're an adult. I'll just talk about the more formative years, when you're in your teens and your tweens and when you're like 5, 6 years old. So they're out of touch. They don't know how to dress their kids. They have these like shitty hand-me-downs that they'll hand their kids, and it'll get them bullied at school, and they won't put in the effort to get their kids newer clothes or things of that nature, and they are just not aware of how people treat each other in this day and age. And this isn't something that has only begun in like the past 30 or 40 or 50 years. This is something that's always existed, but again, that's more with Oofy Doofies. But Oofy Doofy and boomer parents, usually very out of touch. They're not aware of the trends that their children might be trying to fit into to try and get ahead in their lives. And this is a thing I've noticed a lot with boomers, is like with boomers, they just can't cook for shit. They just cook this like disgusting slop type stuff. And it's just like trying to eat off of boomer food is like the worst thing you have to do. Like I had to do that for such a long time and it's just disgusting. It's like watered down meat, like shitty once a day meals or some weird exotic shit they get from like some takeaway restaurant or something. And sometimes they're not even good with like health regulations with like managing their own food. So they'll be cooking like past due meat, and they'll be preparing their meat in like on an unclean surface, and it's just like really ridiculous. And again, with boomers and with oofy doofies, they also, one problem with them, another problem is that they would have children later. Not in like their 20s or early 30s, but in their late 30s, in their 40s, some even in their 50s. And when you have these parents who are in their 40s and 50s having their first child or their only child or one of several children, they just are much less energetic. They aren't going to be able to help their child as much. And like with Oofy Doofy and Boomer parents, they really tend to be, these types of parents really just tend to be unwilling to be with their children in those formative years during this, as I've said, with them being out of touch. And another major problem with having children at an older age for both males and females is the child's more likely to develop mental problems and physical problems, and maybe not as bad as like extreme deformity, but you're older, your sperm is not as strong, or if you're a woman, your eggs aren't as good, And the better genetics quality and genetic stock that you might have isn't going to be passed down to those kids. So you can end up failing your child on a huge level by not giving them the better side of your genes, and it's rather unfortunate. And one thing I'll say is I've noticed sub fives who like. There's two types of sub fives. There's the sub fives who come from the older parents, the parents who really should have had children 10, 15 years prior. And then there's like the sub fives whose parents were in their 20s and their early 30s. And one thing I've noticed is like sub fives who had like younger parents usually don't come out with as much mental problems or even physical problems. I'm not saying that if you're some 3 out of 10 and you marry a 2 out of 10 girl and you both have your first child at 25, the kid's going to be some 6'4" chisel jawed Chad. But the kid's going to be less likely to have certain problems, and maybe some better sides of your genes will come out since you and that wife would be having your child at a more prime age. And again, that's the problem with Oofy Doofy and boomer parents. They just don't know how the world works. They don't teach their children, how to do taxes, how to stand up to bullying, how to manage in the real world, how to do a job interview. So they just don't really help their child get ahead in life. And with boomers, this is more for boomer parents especially, but this can also be the fault of older parents, again from Oofy Doofies, is they've left us off in an economically worse life. These people had their children, they didn't bother to put in the effort to preserve a future for their children. They were overly consumeristic. They didn't take the idea of, hey, we have this economy, we need to try and keep it going, we need to try and keep some market regulations going, or otherwise it might crash. And now we have the Great Recession, and now we're dealing with this strange economic fuckery that's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. And most boomer parents, this is more especially a fault of boomer parents, are not going to really do anything to help their children get ahead in this current economic downturn. And again, the boomers overconsumed. They didn't help, as I said earlier, they didn't help bring the economy forward and try to lead it into the 21st century. And admittedly, there is some fault with like the greatest generation, as they should have really told their children, because the greatest generation grew up during the Great Depression. They should have told their children how to manage a society and how to manage an economy and be cautious with how they handle it, because if they weren't, we now are reaping the consequences of that. So, admittedly, there is some fault from the greatest generation, because they should have taken that time being, uh, of being, living in the depression and understanding just how bad the world could be. And with oofy doofy parents and with boomer parents, this gets into the next thing. They tend to be very unhelpful with giving their children money if they need any, or they're going to kind of gaslight them. I recently had this problem where I was trying to get access to my security stock, and my mom was going, I'm saving that money because you need to build up wealth. And then the next time I confronted her on it, she was going, No, you can't take out money to get food. How dare you? I want to make a separate video on that whole debacle, because it's kind of funny, and I think there will be some interesting things to talk about. But anyways, that was just one thing that I've seen from them, and it's just really pathetic just how unhelpful oofy doofy parents are with raising their children. And then they'll gaslight you about the ideal life and how you should live, and oh, you have to be a good citizen. If you just work hard, you'll get ahead in life, except for the fact that we don't live in a meritocracy. We live in a society. We live in a society and in a world, admittedly, that values looks, and if you're better looking, you're more likely to get promoted, or you can sleep your way to the top, or if you're someone who has a bit of nepotism, you know a guy in places. I'm not saying like someone who gives you a reference to a company or a place of work who gets you hired, but a little bit of corruption and nepotism that gets you suspiciously rising the ranks of a company, even if you haven't been there as long as some tenured 25 someone who's been tenured there for 25 years. So there's that. And they'll tell you to be nice and not to bully people, and that if you're getting bullied, you just need to act all nice to be like, oh, why are you being rude to me? Have a good day, sir. That's also a topic that should go up for another video, because oofy doofy and boomer parents don't tell their children any good advice. They tell them how to live the ideal life, despite the fact we don't live in the ideal world. We don't live in an ideal society where people aren't bullying each other, where people are not being corrupt. Again, that's the problem with boomers is, as I said earlier, they're out of touch. And they just are unable to manage their children. Like with Oofy Doofy parents, we all have probably seen them. We've gone to McDonald's or to the food courts at a shopping center, and we just see these like iPad kids who are running around and who are just like screeching and throwing tantrums. I remember like last year I was sitting on the bus and there was like this a ghetto Asian Floyd who was like had her like five children from Chad and Tyrone, and there was like her little Blasian son was like running up and down the aisle of the bus just shrieking. She was just there checked out. Brutal future for that kid because it's a he and it's an ethnic, so it doesn't have any sort of JBW you can cash. If it was a she, it'd be doing just fine. But again, they cannot manage their children. They don't want to manage their children. Like if a school or a city tries to kind of crack down on the children, you have a school teacher who like tries to punish a child for a just reason, like vandalism or beating up other students. The teacher will try and do that, and the parents will be like, "Oh, why little Jimmy wouldn't do that? You don't know anything. We're going to sue you." And since most school districts in this country, unfortunately, are pretty cucked, they'll be like, "Well, we can't really lay down the law like that, so we'll just let little Jimmy off with a warning." Again, it speaks really to the state of society, and it's really disappointing just how boomers and oofy doofies have really fucked up our society over not even the last 50 years, just over the last 20 years, maybe even the last 15 years. Like, we don't even need to go back to 2000 or 1990, or I know the trad cells like this era, the 1950s and the 60s. But the children of Gen A, increasingly the Zoomers, um, very fragile, very overly animated. It's going to be very curious what happens when these younger Zoomers, the ones born at the end of the 2000s and in the early 2010s, and Gen A, who are now, I think the first of Gen A are reaching 13, 14 years old now, so it's going to be very interesting what happens in 5 or 6 years when these people have driver's licenses and are trying to get jobs. Well, that's if there's an economy in 5 years' time. And it's just something that I've noticed is just we've uplifted the worst elements of humans, and we've chosen not to regulate how a society should function because, oh, that's communism, bro. You're telling me that we need to not do these certain antisocial behaviors? That's communism. Yeah. Which, even if that was true, so what? How does society benefit from all these kids who are going around throwing tantrums? And I'm not even talking like the generic 14, 15-year olds who do like vandalism on a Friday night. I'm talking these kids who are going to department stores or into shopping centers, and they're sitting there on the floor throwing tantrums, or they're grabbing things off the shelf and throwing them. Or you see these like shitty TikTokers who are going into like behind the counters of a McDonald's or a KFC, and they're just like throwing things around, and they're like, "Hey, I pranked you." Or they're going to, again, the shopping centers, throwing things at people and calling that a prank, or just doing all this like fringy, terrible stuff. And back to the failures of Oofy Doofy and boomer parents, especially with Oofy Doofies. They cannot, and they usually don't want to stop domestic violence that occurs towards a child. It'll usually be some blank threats, or at times it'll be the other parent siding with the abusive parent, going, "You did something to cause this. This is your fault." And both start abusing them. Like, it reminds me of that video ITV did about a year and a half ago with that ogre cell from New Jersey who essentially put his kid on a treadmill for like an ungodly amount of time and essentially made the kid exercise to death and also beat him up and did all these terrible things to this kid. And I remember ITV made a good point when he said that the Floyd who got knocked up by him probably wasn't crying and getting emotional and all this stuff when she was being all Chad ogre struck for this ogre cell. And again, I can speak from personal experience because whenever I've like told my mom that my dad has been abusing me. It's like, oh, he doesn't mean it. He just doesn't know how to express himself. He doesn't know how to manage himself. You need to forgive him because it's in the Bible. Yes, that's a real thing I've heard. I've said it. I mean that I've heard. And I've like, and when I've said this to other people, like about what my mom said about, oh, it's in the Bible, you need to forgive him. Like they laugh and they're like, what is your mom on? And I kind of wonder the same thing too, because you have this just delusional, and actually it's not even delusional. It's just they don't care. Like a lot of oofy doofy parents, the dad's beating the kid up or raping the kid. Um, and then they're all like, whatever, you didn't mean anything like that, Sonny. You just gotta sit there and take it. And it's just really disappointing. And I can tell that when this happened to me back about 18 years ago, my dad nearly beat me to death. Like my mom just gave him some blank warnings of like, oh, you better not do this again, Oofy Doofy, or else. And nothing came from that. Like if I was a parent and my child and I had my child getting abused by my wife, and my wife tries to beat the kid to death, there's not going to be this, oh, you better watch out, honey. I'm warning you. It's going to be, this relationship's over. I'm reporting this to the police and I'm getting a divorce and all that. I'm aware that, again, men usually don't win custody in these things, but again, there has to be some actual attempt at least to put pressure on the Oofy Doofy. And again, I think a lot of people are not going to care when, back to the boomers, they aren't going to care when the boomers reach their expiration date, which they are increasingly doing. And I think it was said about 10 years ago that beginning in the mid 2020s, you would see boomers dying off more quickly now, which, good riddance. But I and probably 95% of people watching this video, and probably an increasing amount of society, is not going to feel too upset over the demise of boomers. Whether it be their boomer parents, again, if they were oofy doofy boomer parents, or just the generic boomers who sat in Congress too long and passed all these financial deregulations and who passed all these crackdowns on unions. And it's just something that I am not going to feel sorry for, and I don't think most people are. I think increasingly you're going to see boomer fatigue, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And it will be kind of interesting though if like less and less people care for boomers, and you see all these like retirement homes get shut down and defunded and deregulated, and you just see children of these oofy doofies or these boomers not coming to rescue their child, to for their child to come and rescue them. And I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen in mass, but you probably will see that in the coming years. And again, a lot of these boomers had it coming. They brought it on themselves. And I don't really know what the response is going to be to this generation of boomer degeneracy and oofy doofy parenting. And I don't know how this is going to play out. Really, we don't have to talk about 2040 or 2050, but as soon as 2035, maybe as soon as 2030, we might have to start asking these questions. And we do need to start asking these questions now because things are going to get worse economically. And I think societally we are in some sort of decline. And I don't say this from the trad cell type way. I just say this as in parenting has gotten weaker, and most of these oofy doofy couples are the problem. And I'm going to end the video off saying this, that if you're going to have children, especially as a sub 5, and I think sub 5s and having children should also be its own video, but I'll make that when the time comes. But I think that if you're going to have children as a sub 5, don't do it when you're 35. Be careful of the void you get with, I get it, it's a sub 5, you're going to be in a beta buck's dead bedroom anyways, but just make sure you're not simping for some crack whore or something along those lines, because it's not going to be good for that child. It's going to be even worse for your physical and mental health, and it'll just be another casualty of life. So, I'm out, boyos. Shoot your comments in the Howling Madness. Like, comment, and share. I'm out. Later.